I wanted to hit on just spend a few minutes on some of my experiences and observations over the last 3 months of how landlords and tenants sort of renegotiated leases during this period and what lessons that might give us as we go forward and think about lease negotiations in the future. And what I saw, as I said, I probably talked or represented an equal number of landlords and tenants across industries, industrial, office, retail, and they're all different. Every situation's unique, but there were definitely some common threads. I think when a tenant was able to articulate with a lot of specificity the specific nature of the hardship that they were encountering, that helped a lot to advance the negotiation and to find solutions. One of my favorite examples was, and this actually happened, a client of mine contacted me and said, our tenant is telling us they can't pay, we don't know what to do. When we sat down and looked a little further, we realized that the tenant involved was actually involved in a medical supply chain business. It was a manufacturing business. And they were not experiencing any financial hardship. If anything, they were running 3 shifts. They were going like gangbusters. They were getting all sorts of contracts to provide different crisis medical technology to different parts of the country and the world. So that tenant initially had a hard time articulating what the hardship was. What we learned later was that that was just one business line and that other parts of their business were suffering significantly, and they were able to demonstrate that and articulate it, and it helped with our ultimate settlement with them. But on the face of it, it was not apparent that they were suffering any sort of hardship. So that was an interesting situation. The difference between forbearance, meaning we'll give you an extra period of time to pay, versus outright abatement, and we just don't want to pay the rent. It wasn't always clear what was more appropriate for a particular tenant, and I think the ability to, have an honest discussion about what was needed to help the business and to restructure appropriately was also helpful. And I think in some cases there really was a hybrid. There might have been some rent forgiveness, but then also, maybe for the month of April, we'll let you pay half the rent and we'll defer collecting May rent until the end of the year. So it was maybe a hybrid of things. But again, being able to articulate why that was important, I think helped. As we talked about, security deposits were a big issue, especially as April 1st hit and the first rent payment was coming due. I think landlords initially were reluctant to rely on security deposits for obvious reasons. They would lose their security going forward. And it wasn't clear if this was going to be a long period of time or short period, and they wanted to have that security deposit in hand. So in some cases, some of the laws around this helped to break the logjam. In other cases, you had tenants offering up, if it was appropriate, maybe personal guarantees, corporate guarantees, or other security of some sort, if they could. So that was, I think, a big issue, and I think it will cause people to rethink security deposits going forward. We had several landlords who had large letters of credit as a security deposit, and tenants were panicked that they were going to draw on those and what that might mean for their banking relationships and the collateral they needed to have to support the security deposit, the letter of credit. So, and I know we've had a couple questions already about good guy guarantees. So I think there may be a new look at how good guy guarantees are put in place and what they mean and what they're intended to cover. As we talked about earlier, operating expenses, additional rent, was the hot topic among every lease negotiation that I did. And at least in the commercial space for the leases I worked on, in almost every instance, the tenant was required to continue to pay operating expenses. For obvious reasons, the landlords still had to pay their taxes, still had to clean the buildings, still had to keep the lights on and the electricity and landscaping and other things. So again, I'd be curious if people in this group had different experiences on that issue, but except for tenants that were teetering on the brink of bankruptcy or were going to fail outright, operating expenses became almost universally required. Finally, the need for financial statements. This kind of goes with the first issue of the nature of the business hardship. I think a lot of landlords who might not regularly review financial statements of tenants, they might get them once a year or with less frequency. It was important for them to see financial statements, both to understand that this was otherwise a strong and stable business that, but for COVID, would be in a good position. I think my landlord clients were much more likely to negotiate and restructure a lease if they had confidence that the core business was strong. Also to sort of demonstrate the impact of COVID. If you could produce January and February financial statements and then show the impact in March and April financial statements, I think those tenants were much more successful in negotiating some sort of rent relief. So going forward, I don't usually spend a lot of time on these sorts of provisions and leases, but I think requiring financial statements more regularly in a lease might be something that landlords look for. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily a bad thing for a tenant either, although I know it takes time and effort to produce them. But that's something that I think we'll see maybe more discussion around, or a little bit of a different discussion around that going forward. So those are some of the provisions that I'm seeing. The other thing that I did not make it into the PowerPoint, but also was a big factor that was specifically COVID related, was landlords were requiring that tenants apply for PPP loans. And I assume most of you are familiar with the PPP program from the federal government that provided loans that were forgivable. So they required that tenants apply for those, and if they were successful in receiving those, that the portion of the money that the federal government set aside for rent would have to go to the landlord to pay the rent. So those were very important as well. And for the most part, tenants were willing to do that. It was in their best interest to apply for the PPP loans, and if they did get them, in order for those loans to be forgivable, there were certain allocations of how the money had to be spent. And I don't have the exact percentage, but a portion of it had to go towards rent payments, or could go towards rent payments. So tenants were actually very willing to cooperate and were willing to do that. So again, my experience on these lease negotiations was very much, and again, I'd very much welcome anyone who had different experiences, but they were fairly collaborative. Landlords and tenants that had a good relationship pre-COVID, where there was a lot of trust, there was a lot of communication, the landlords understood the tenants' businesses and had a sense of their financial condition, and they maybe had a history of working through things in the past. Those were the most successful lease restructurings and lease negotiations. So it's a good lesson for me going forward to make sure that landlords and tenants, whatever the lease looks like, that they, going forward throughout the term of a lease, maintain a lot of communication and a good relationship and honest dialogue and that sort of thing, because it certainly helped when this sort of unprecedented trouble hit. They were able to work through things much more successfully than the ones that didn't have that kind of relationship.